So I want to read to you the results of a couple of surveys, okay? These are two surveys that were done, the first one in 1970 and the second one in the year 2005. In each of these surveys, 3,000 women, well sampled for race, class, age, region, religion, etc. 3,000 women were asked what they thought about men. So what you'll hear is the difference between what they said in 1970 and what you might extrapolate they might say roughly today. Just a couple of items from this survey. In 1970, 2/3 of the women agreed with the statement, men are basically kind and considerate. Now, 46% agree with that statement, a decrease of more than 20%, okay? Yeah, that's the trend. You'll hear it through all the other ones. 1970, 41% of the women said men's egos require that they put women down. Now, 58% agree with that statement. In 1970, 44% of the women said all a man really wants from a date is to go to bed. Now, 71% agree with that statement. And last, and actually even more telling than that third one, in 1970, 39% of the women said all a man is interested in is his career, not his family. And now, after 35 years of the new fatherhood, the Cosby Show, at least the first Cosby Show, 56% of women said all a man is interested in is his career, not his family. So what's going on here? Is it possible that men are doing worse now than we were doing 35 years ago? I don't think that's the way to read that data at all. I think, in fact, it points to something quite different. It points to the differences in women's lives. That in the past 35 or 40 years, women's lives have changed so utterly that they now expect more from men and they're more disappointed. I think that's really what that data suggests. That in the past 40 years or so, women's lives have changed fundamentally. So let me start by pointing out some ways in which women's lives have changed as a context for the conversation about men. Now, the first way women's lives have changed the past 40 years is so obvious, I certainly don't have to bring it, I don't have to tell you, and that is women made gender visible. We now know that gender is one of the organizing principles of social life. We now know that gender is one of the foundations of your identity. Let me tell you, 40 years ago, we didn't know this. If you went to graduate school 40 years ago and said, I want to study gender, there was not one course you could take. If you said you wanted to study women, there was one course you could take. It was called Marriage and the Family. For years, that was like the ladies' auxiliary of the social sciences. Today, of course, there's women's studies courses, gender studies courses on every campus in the country. But often, today's students don't realize just how new that is. The first women's studies program was founded in 1972 at San Diego State. It's that recent. So that's the first area of change in women's lives. Women made gender visible. Second area of change in women's lives is around the workplace. It's the biggest demographic transformation of the labor force ever. How many of the women in here, let me ask you, how many of the women here expect to have full-time jobs outside the home when you graduate from Occidental? Let me see your hand. Okay, now please keep your hands up if your mother has or had a job outside the home for at least 10 years without an interruption. This is your mom's. Okay, how about grandmothers? Okay, thanks. Okay, so here's what I saw. When I asked you, virtually every hand went up. When I asked about mothers, I guess about 2/3 to 3/4 of the hands were still up. And when I asked about grandmothers, I counted about 10 hands still up. So what you see in this room is that in 3 generations, women's expectations and experience around the labor force have changed utterly. Now, what would happen if I asked the men the same question? How many of the men expect to have full-time jobs outside the home when you graduate from here? It's all right, we knew that. And of course, you keep your hands up for dad, grandpa, great-grandpa, because men's relationship to the workplace hasn't changed very much at all. And that's led to a third area of change in women's lives, and that's the balance between work and family. Not that long ago, women believed that they couldn't have both family lives and careers. Remember your hands for grandma. So, but today, of course, women want don't you love that phrase, can women have it all? Can women have exciting, glamorous careers outside the home and warm, loving, supportive families to come home to? And the answer is, of course, no. And the reason women can't have it all is because men do. We're the ones who have the careers outside the home and the warm, loving, supportive families to come home to, because women do the second shift. Women do the housework, women do the childcare, we men have it all. So if women are going to really be able to finally balance work and family, we men are going to have to do something different. I will come back to that in a bit. And the fourth area of change in women's lives is around sex. Now this is the hardest one for us guys to wrap our heads around, because we thought the sexual revolution was all about us. I mean, the sexual revolution promised more access to more partners with fewer commitments. Could you come up with a more masculine definition of sexual revolution than that? But if you look, as I have, at the mountain of sex research data that has been collected over the past 30 or 40 years, there was only one conclusion you would come to, and that is, it's women's sexuality that's changed, not men's. Now, the easiest way to summarize this change in women's sexuality is to say, women today feel entitled to pleasure. Women today know that they can want sex, like sex, go for it, get horny. And I'm not talking about some bohemian enclave in San Francisco or Greenwich Village here. I'm talking about mainstream American mall-going, Victoria's Secret-wearing women. Now, being a social scientist, you're probably saying to yourself, yeah, well, how could you prove that empirically, right? And this isn't the kind of thing, those of you who've taken social science courses, you know, we only think in 4 categories: a lot, some, a little, or nothing. And this is not the kind of information, your sexual entitlement, your sexual agency, your sexual voice. You can't exactly get this through an attitude survey. Like, how sexually agentic do you feel? A lot, some, a little, or not at all? You get no useful data. You need a behavioral measure of sexual entitlement, or entitlement to pleasure. So I have one. Here's one. How about rates of masturbation? It's like I'm in a funeral now. I have to say, now I teach at a very different school than Occidental. I teach at a school where I teach a class, for example, called Sex and Society to 420 students, right? Course on intimacy. And let me tell you, my students would be perfectly happy to talk about the most esoteric, bizarre sexual perversion that like 2 people do. But talk about masturbation, which virtually everyone's doing. No, don't go there. Please don't go there. Think about it. Isn't masturbation the best behavioral measure of the entitlement to pleasure you could ever possibly come up with? I'm so entitled to pleasure, I'll do it myself.